A man named Daniel Burrow that lied about being a doctor made women pay to have sex with him. The manager's concern, a Holiday Inn in South San Francisco. It was a routine morning for the manager of a modest Holiday Inn in South San Francisco named Luis Ortega, as we'll call him. However, his routine took a bizarre turn when one of his employees, a diligent front desk associate named Isabella, approached him asking for a sizable loan of about $1,000. Isabella wouldn't say much about why she needed it, except that it was for urgent medical expenses. Though suspicious, Ortega had no reason to doubt her sincerity. She was a reliable employee, always punctual and polite. But a series of offhand remarks about needing to meet someone at the Hyatt Hotel for treatment made Ortega's ears perk up. Over the next few days, Ortega realized Isabella was deeply distressed. She mentioned being diagnosed with a bizarre, life-threatening disease, yet never provided any documentation. She also said a certain doctor, Stevens, had insisted on total secrecy. The manager grew uncomfortable. Why the secrecy? Why the hush-hush trip to another hotel for a procedure? Worried for her well-being and suspecting a scam, he decided to call the police, asking them to do a welfare check. What the police found at the Hyatt Hotel would crack open the entire fiasco. They discovered Isabella and an unknown man alone in a hotel room, seemingly in the middle of a sexual encounter. At first, it looked like a consenting adult scenario, two individuals who had just finished being intimate. But once they separated the two for questioning, Isabella's story spilled out in jittery, breathless fragments. She thought she was there to receive a serum that would cure her otherwise fatal illness. Isabella's story, a terrifying diagnosis. During her interrogation at the police station, Isabella recounted in excruciating detail how her life had recently upended. She explained that she'd been at work in the hotel's lobby days earlier when she received a frantic phone call from a man calling himself Dr. Stevens. The voice on the line was urgent, half-panicked, warning her that a blood test from her last hospital visit revealed a dangerous, highly infectious disease that was almost certainly lethal if not treated immediately. Because of the so-called seriousness, Dr. Stevens said he had broken protocol by calling her. His voice quavered with supposed worry, claiming that because Isabella worked in a position where she interacted with countless guests, she risked potential lawsuits for unknowingly infecting others. Isabella described how fear overtook her. She pictured being sued, fired, or inadvertently spreading a fatal disease. She asked Dr. Stevens about her treatment options. His immediate answer was bleak. A painful, prohibitively expensive $50,000 surgery. Of course, she could never afford such a sum. When she despaired, he offered a second option, an experimental serum with an astonishing 100% success rate. The catch was that it wasn't publicly available. The only individuals with access were those already in a closed clinical trial. The window for new participants had passed, or so Dr. Stevens claimed. Then came the good news. Doctor. Stevens told her about an alternative route, so unorthodox it barely sounded real. The serum, according to him, could be transmitted from one body to another through sexual intercourse. He said he knew a certain patient in possession of the serum. If Isabella had sex with this patient, she'd get the life-saving substance. The cost? A single act for about $4,000, still far less than $50,000 for an invasive surgery. When Isabella stuttered that she couldn't pay $4,000 up front, Dr. Stevens suggested a partial payment of $1,000 to get started. She panicked, turned to her manager for a personal loan, and he, out of compassion, agreed, despite sensing something fishy. Dr. Stevens hammered in a final rule. Isabella was not to tell anyone about these arrangements. He justified the secrecy by citing medical privacy laws, claiming it would complicate matters if the experimental drug protocol was discovered. She believed him, terrified by the possibility of losing a once-in-a-lifetime chance at survival. The Hyatt Hotel Encounter. The next step was a rendezvous at a designated Hyatt hotel room. Isabella arrived with her heart in her throat. She'd been told there would be no conversation with the patient, no exchange of names, no idle chit-chat. According to Dr. Stevens, these instructions were standard protocol for experimental, off-the-record treatments. She forced herself to comply, her mind swirling with fear. She'd come to get injected with the serum. The man inside greeted her with no words, only gestures. They both removed their clothes. Isabella felt ill, but her desperation overshadowed her reluctance. She reasoned, if this will save my life, so be it. So they had sex. Unbeknownst to Isabella, her manager had simultaneously placed a concerned call to the local police, explaining that he feared she was being duped in some shady medical scheme. So, in the middle of that night, law enforcement barged into the Hyatt suite, interrupting a post-coital hush. The man, half-dressed, tried to maintain composure. Isabella, wide-eyed, tried to explain to the police that she was simply receiving a medical procedure. The illusions shattered the moment she recognized her so-called partner's voice. It was identical to the voice on the phone who had called himself Dr. Stevens. Police arrested the man on the spot. At the station, his real identity emerged. Daniel Burrow. He had no medical degree, nor any affiliation with a legitimate hospital. It appeared he'd orchestrated the entire plan, from faking phone calls as Dr. Stevens to prescribing a sexual cure for a made-up lethal disease. He'd even collected a partial payment from Isabella, which she'd gleaned from her manager's loan. The larger scam. As the investigation deepened, it wasn't just Isabella caught in Daniel's web. Police discovered that Daniel had pulled similar stunts throughout various corners of California. Over at least 3 years, multiple women had come forward or were identified through leads. Some had parted with a few $100s, others a couple thousand. A few bizarrely had no regrets, praising the cure, and even gifting Daniel wine or gifts in gratitude. Each story followed the same pattern: a phone call from a frantic doctor, a terrifying diagnosis, and an offer to have sex with an anonymous patient carrying the serum. Local newspapers and TV stations picked up the story, labeling it the cure fraud, and published bulletins asking potential victims to come forward. Investigators believed that Daniel might have defrauded over 30 women in San Francisco and Orange County alone, with possible expansions as far as Hawaii. The media coverage stoked public outrage. Some called Daniel a manipulative rapist. Others saw him as a con man who preyed on fear. Everyone, however, agreed on one detail. The entire premise was a twisted exploitation of vulnerability. A legal tangle? Is it rape? As the case headed to trial, the big question loomed. Did Daniel's deception amount to rape, or was it merely a grave form of fraud? On the one hand, these women, including Isabella, consented to have sex. On the other, it was obviously under a false pretext. Prosecutors argued this was tantamount to sexual assault, like a doctor secretly tricking patients into intercourse under the guise of a vaginal exam. They cited a prior precedent in California, where a real physician was convicted after blindfolding women for gynecological procedures, only to have actual intercourse with them. The courts had upheld that as rape. But Daniel's defense pointed out a difference. Those prior cases involved women who did not know they were having sex at all. They believed instruments were used, not a penis. Here, with Daniel's victims, they did know they were having sex. Their misapprehension lay in why they were having it, not what act they were performing. So it became a matter of fraud in fact versus fraud in the inducement. Fraud in fact means the victims think they're undergoing a non-sexual procedure, but are actually being penetrated. They do not realize it's sex. Fraud in the inducement means they understand it's sex, but are tricked regarding some aspect of it, such as the purpose, identity, or consequences. Under California's then existing statutes, fraud in the inducement was not enough to establish rape. For it to be rape, the victim had to believe it was not sexual intercourse at all. Fraud, in fact. In Daniel's scenario, the women believed it was indeed intercourse, but done for medical reasons. As appalling as that is ethically, the law at the time did not categorize it as rape. Courtroom verdict and legal amendments. After a lengthy trial, Daniel was found guilty of multiple crimes: attempted grand theft, procurement through false pretenses, burglary, and various fraud-related counts. However, the courts ruled that his actions did not meet the statutory definition of rape. The judge acknowledged the moral outrage, but stuck to legal precedent. These women knew they were consenting to intercourse, even if under false illusions of life-saving treatment. Public backlash was fierce. Activists argued that lying about fatal diseases to scare women into sex is, at its core, non-consensual. How can one truly consent when coerced by fear of death? In response, the California legislature eventually revised the laws to include certain rape by fraud exceptions, clarifying that terrorizing someone with threats of severe harm or using fraudulent claims of impending death could qualify as an invalid form of consent. By then, Daniel had already begun serving time, though not under the label of a rapist. The new laws served as a cautionary tale for future cases, but the damage to the known victims had already been done. Isabella's recovery. For Isabella, the ordeal didn't end with Daniel's arrest. She struggled with immense guilt. She had parted with money that wasn't even hers, borrowed from her boss, and subjected herself to a horrifying sexual experience she never truly wanted. She wrestled with panic attacks, nightmares, and depression. She had to swallow the reality that, by law's standards, she had consented to that sexual encounter. Officially, she might be labeled a victim of fraud, not rape, leaving her stuck in a gray area that felt deeply violating but wasn't recognized as standard sexual assault. Still, over time, Isabella found a therapist who helped her parse the difference between what she truly consented to and what had been forced upon her by fear and falsehoods. She received some measure of closure knowing Daniel was behind bars for his other crimes, although it pained her that the court's decision left a confusing message about the nature of sexual consent. She maintained a cordial relationship with her manager, who felt deeply sorry that he hadn't prevented the scam before it happened. But in truth, Isabella knew he'd saved her from further harm by calling the police at just the right moment. Eventually, Isabella relocated to a different part of California to start anew. She took a job far from hotels, her trust in that environment shattered. She reclaimed her life piece by piece, discovering a resilience in herself she never thought possible. Sometimes she'd see news updates about changed laws or similar cases cropping up, and her mind would flash back to that ephemeral moment in the Hyatt room, a moment that felt so real and yet so obviously false at the same time. The ongoing debate. Though Daniel's case concluded years ago, the moral and legal debate it raised continues. People still ask, where should the law draw the line between lying for sex and raping someone under false pretenses? If lying about a disease to get sex is not rape, but lying about a non-sexual procedure is, does that truly serve justice? Many remain unsatisfied, though the updated California laws have narrowed that gap somewhat by clarifying that fear of severe harm, physical or otherwise, could invalidate consent. Some critics worry that an overly broad rape by fraud law might criminalize trivial lies told in bars or at parties, like someone lying about their job or income to impress a potential partner. Others argue that equating those small lies with Daniel's elaborate fear-based con is a false equivalence. In the end, the legal system tries to tread carefully, distinguishing catastrophic lies that induce fear of death or physical harm from casual fibs about personal details. A tale of fear and fraud. The story of Daniel Burrow and the women he duped stands as a stark reminder of how cunning exploitation of fear can override the usual boundaries of consent. Each woman, in her own way, believed she was saving her life by having sex with a stranger. Some were even grateful enough to gift him tokens of appreciation afterwards. In a perverse twist, their illusions only collapsed when an outside party intervened, or when investigative reporters and police connected the dots among multiple victims. For many, especially Isabella, the final blow was learning that, by law, what they endured didn't meet the strict definition of rape at the time, but rather fraud in the inducement. It's an unsettling concept that consenting to an act, even if misled about the reasons, can, in the eyes of the law, remain consent. Yet the emotional toll was as scarring as any sexual assault could be. The shame, the sense of violation, the betrayal of trust. In the end, it's a sobering reminder that the lines between deceit, fear, and consent can be alarmingly fragile. People might do almost anything under the right or wrong psychological pressure. And while the law evolves, these real or fictional stories illuminate the moral complexities that swirl when deception and desperation intertwine with sexual acts. The conclusion, for many, is that trust in one's health, trust in the word of an alleged professional, can be weaponized in terrifying ways. The final hope is that by exposing such manipulations, fewer individuals will fall prey to them, and the law can stand as a stronger guardian of true consent.